have a special guest today. Stealing the Mind was in Spokane yesterday, and I happened to notice on the list that Dr. Andy Wood would be speaking there. Andy and I are friends. I asked him if he would come and join us. Andy is a professor of theology. He is a teacher. He is a pastor. He's a member of the pre-trib study group that we're both a part of, and we love being a part of that every year as we go and think through lots of topics, and it's an exciting time for fellowship. I would love it if you guys would help me welcome Dr. Andy Woods.
Wow. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. If we could take our Bibles and open them to the book of Hosea, chapter 4 and verse 6. We'll be touching base with that verse of Scripture in a little bit. You know, every once in a while you run into these things called oxymorons, two statements that contradict each other. Jumbo shrimp, Microsoft works, postal service, government intelligence, reasonable attorney's fees, stuff like that. So God kind of made me unique. I'm actually a Christian, but I'm also an attorney. How do you like that? Kind of an anomaly, isn't it? So one of the things that I've been doing through some lenses that God gave me through the study of laws, I've been studying what the devil has been doing very diligently for several decades now. And how many of you know America is in trouble? Okay, we don't have to convince people of that. And the reason we're in trouble is really not because Party A or Party B is running things. It really has to do with the fact that we have been snipped from severed from our Judeo-Christian moorings. The United States of America is unique amongst the nations of the earth because there hasn't been a country that's ever started, other than Israel herself, that's had such a strong Judeo-Christian influence. I mean, it's on our money, it's on all of the monuments in Washington. It doesn't really take a lot to prove that. But you see, despite this gift that we've been given, the Satan has been at work. And he has been working over and over again, particularly in the legal system, to chop us away from our origins and to sort of make us think as if America was just sort of this experiment done by a bunch of atheists and deists. And so we have been virtually removed from our Judeo-Christian heritage, and there's a phrase that the enemy has used over and over and over and over again to do this, and this is something called a strict wall of separation between church and state. Has anybody ever heard that expression? It's a very popular expression. So what I'd like to do today, as God allows it, is to shed some light on this. And I want us to become equipped to interact with the darkness that we're in. I want us to be equipped on how to properly teach our children and grandchildren, because they're not getting the truth from the school system. Do you all know that? The truth has got to come to them through grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, pastor. And so this is really a time of equipping, and we're dealing with what I call the big lie, the separation between church and state. Even before we get into that, I'm not at all arguing here that church and state should be merged. I want them to be different institutions. God set them up as different institutions. He set up the government. You find references to that in places like Romans 13, 1 through 7. Then he also set up the church, and they have very different functions. But you see, what the devil has done is he has used this expression, a strict wall of separation between church and state, so frequently to make us think that we as Christians can have no say over the direction of our government, to make people believe that a Bible-based worldview had absolutely nothing to do with the origins of America. So that's sort of the direction that we're moving in this morning, and I got to warn you a little bit. The first part of this presentation will depress you. And I know it's going to depress you because it depressed me putting it together. But I'm going to try to end with a point of optimism and not just curse the darkness, but to light a candle. Good name for candlelight fellowship. So we're going to try to move in that spirit today as God helps us. But where did this whole thing start? Well, it started in 1962 in a case called Engel versus Vitale, involving a prayer which was non-denominational in public schools. It was non-compulsory in the sense that you could opt out of the prayer if you chose to in the public schools. It was voluntary. It spans about 22 words, and it takes about 10 seconds to read. You ready for this prayer? Here we go. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. That's a really jihadist prayer, isn't it? Real dangerous stuff there. Well, the Supreme Court steps in a case called Engel versus Vitale and says, you can't do that anymore. You're violating the strict wall of separation between church and state. And then what happened not too long after that, the next year, 1963, in a case called Abington Township versus Shemp. This dealt with Bible reading in the schools. A student would stand up in front of a class in the year 1963. They would read something from the Bible in front of the class. Now, this was not teacher-led. It was student-led. It was voluntary. You could opt out of it if you wished. And no sermons were given, no instruction was given, no commentary was given. The student could read from any Bible version they chose, and this had been a practice for a long time in American public schools. The Supreme Court steps in a second time and says, you can't do that. You're violating a strict wall of separation between church and state. And from those two decisions, the parade of horribles begins, because then they tried to post the Ten Commandments on the schoolhouse wall. Real dangerous things, by the way. Don't murder, don't steal, real bad things. And the Supreme Court steps in and says you can't do that. It violates a strict wall between separation of church and state, and on it goes. Can we teach anything that contradicts evolution in the classroom? No, you can't do that because that violates a strict wall of separation between church and state. And on things have progressed negatively beginning in 1962 and 1963. But the root of it all is this metaphor, the strict wall of separation between church and state. And sort of to equip us, I want to go through, before we go to some points of application, 9 problems with this. 9 problems with what the Supreme Court started to do in 1962 and 1963. This will be different than a sermon that you're probably used to. It deals with some American history, and it deals with some legal issues, but track with me the best you can, because I think as you listen to this, you're going to be blessed, and God is going to use it to fortify you to be His ambassador into a world of darkness in these last days. So 9 problems with this strict wall of separation between church and state mentality. Number 1, the Supreme Court, when they came up with this phrase, a strict wall between separation between church and state, read words into the First Amendment that are not there. Most people think the phrase, the strict wall of separation between church and state, is in the First Amendment. Let's look at the First Amendment. Here's what it says. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, you'll notice there are two clauses. The first part of that is called the Establishment Clause. Basically says Congress cannot establish a religion. And then the second part of that is the Free Exercise Clause, which basically says the government, Congress, cannot interfere with religion. Now, what do you not see here? You don't find the phrase, the strict wall of separation between church and state. Do you see the word strict there? No. Do you see the word wall there? No. Do you see the word separation there? No. Do you see the word church there? No. Do you see the word state there? No. Other than that, I guess they're fairly close. And it's sort of interesting, courts, when you watch them, they admit this. They admit there's sleight of hand going on here. So a New York court said this: much has been written in recent years concerning Thomas Jefferson's reference in an 1802 letter to a wall of separation between church and state. It has received so much attention that one would almost think at times it is to be found somewhere in the Constitution. Most Americans think this phrase is there. Most attorneys think this phrase is there. But the fact of the matter is, it's not there. I'll tell you where you do find it, though. You do find it in the Constitution of the former Soviet Union, an atheistic country. It says, in order to ensure citizens' freedom of conscience, the church in the USSR is separated from the state. So you find it in atheistic countries, but you don't find it in America's founding documents. So where in the world did this come from? Well, as I mentioned a few moments ago, it comes from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson in 1802. Now, the court relied upon this letter to come up with this phrase. And that should seem sort of suspicious to us, because 1802 is roughly about over 10 years after our Constitution was debated, adopted, and ratified. So they didn't rely upon what the actual debates of the Constitution were about. They relied upon something written over a decade after the fact. And most people don't know this, but Thomas Jefferson, the originator of this phrase, was not present. He was America's ambassador to France at the time. He was not even in the country when the Constitution was adopted. So here is Thomas Jefferson acknowledging that in a personal letter. He said, "One passage in the paper you enclosed to me must be corrected. It is the following. And all say it was yourself more than any other individual that planned and established, i.e. the Constitution." Jefferson says, "I was in Europe when the Constitution was planned and never saw it until after it was established." So of all of the people involved in the putting together of our Constitution, the court decides to rely upon someone who wasn't even there. And they decide to rely upon someone who wrote a letter over a decade after the Constitution was brought into existence. That's the first major problem. Second problem with what the Supreme Court did in 1962 and 1963 is they took out of context Jefferson's letter. Thomas Jefferson is an interesting guy. But one of the things that you discover when you get into the life of Thomas Jefferson is he was against denominationalism. He was not against the generic principles of Christianity that transcend denominations. So Thomas Jefferson was against the idea that America should be a Baptist country, an Episcopalian country, a Presbyterian country. That type of thing bothered him, but he was never against the generic principles that all Christian denominations across the spectrum believed in. How do we know that? Well, we know that by looking at Jefferson's life. One historian sums it up this way: it was Jefferson, after all, who approved of funds for evangelizing the native Indians. It was also Jefferson who attended church on federal property. Most of his administration approved still of other churches on federal property. And look at this last part. He even ordered the Marine Band to play in his church. Doesn't sound like a guy that was Christophobic, if I can use that expression. And of course, Thomas Jefferson, although he wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, he was very instrumental in authoring the Declaration of Independence, which goes back to 1776, which precedes our Constitution. It's America's birth certificate. And when he authored that Declaration of Independence, you notice how he frequently mentions God. The laws of nature and nature's God. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are evolved equally. Oh, I'm sorry, it doesn't say that. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Aren't you glad that you live in a country where your rights come from God? If we ever lose sight of that fact, then we start to think man gives us rights. And if man can give us rights, what can man do? Take them away. But if we understand that our rights come from a Creator which transcends government or man, no government, no politician is in a position to take away something that only God can give. The United States government does not grant rights. It recognizes pre-existing rights as given by God and seeks to protect those rights. And this was the mindset of Thomas Jefferson. So, what is going on? Well, he wrote a letter around 1802, as I mentioned, to some Danbury Baptists. And he uses in this letter this expression, a strict wall of separation between church and state. Now, if you track that phrase historically, separation of church and state, prior to this letter, what you'll discover is that phrase was always applied not to the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, but to the Free Exercise Clause. In other words, when Thomas Jefferson used this expression, separation between church and state, what he was assuring these Baptists in Danbury is, don't worry, the government is never going to interfere with your church and your church service and your operation of the church. But you see, what the Supreme Court did is they took that expression, separation between church and state, and they didn't apply it in 1962 and 1963 to the Free Exercise Clause, but they applied it to the what? The Establishment Clause. And in the process, they totally took out of context what Jefferson said. Jefferson never meant by that expression that Christians can have no involvement in the government. What he meant is the government can't interfere with Christianity. And post-Jefferson, the only other time before 1962 and 1963 this phrase has ever shown up is in 1878 in a case called Reynolds versus Sims. And there, once again, the expression was applied not to the Establishment Clause, but to the Free Exercise Clause. So in 1962 and 1963, when the court grabbed hold of this expression, they wrenched out of context what Jefferson said. I don't know how to be nice about this other than to say that's a work of the devil. Because who is the father of lies? Satan. John 8:44 tells us that. And if you get into any study on the cults, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, these types of groups, what you'll discover is they're constantly wrenching things out of context, biblically. The three rules of Bible study are context, context, context. Just like in real estate, the three rules are location, location, location. And the three rules in the study of history are also context, context, context. We need to be equipped with the context of American history and teach it to our children and our grandchildren, because if they don't understand the context, they will fall prey to anybody who takes words out of context. So the second problem here is they took Jefferson's letter out of context. Number three, the court in 1962 and 1963, when they removed Christianity from public life, is they ignored the legislative activities of those who authored the First Amendment. Now, there's a way to figure out what legislatures mean when they pass different laws. what do the phrases that they use actually mean? Well, one of the ways you can tell is you track the legislative history, both before and after, of that particular lawmaking body. And if you look at what they have done before and after they passed a given law, you can get an understanding of what they meant by a certain law. So the very people that debated, adopted, ratified the First Amendment, very close thereafter also passed the Northwest Ordinance, which says this: religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall ever be encouraged. Does that sound like a bunch of people that wanted to strip Christianity from public life? Not at all. In fact, you go back beforehand, and what you'll discover is the Liberty Bell. You know, most of us know a little something about the Liberty Bell. We even know about that giant crack on the Liberty Bell. How many of you know that there's a piece of scripture on the Liberty Bell? Leviticus 25:10 is on the Liberty Bell, which says, proclaim liberty throughout all of the land to its inhabitants. Again, with this historical background, it does not look at all as if the founding fathers wanted to strip the generic Christian expressions from public life. So here is a quote in terms of pointing out the foolishness of what the secularist has done. This jurist was Justice Warren Burger, and he says a significant example of the contemporaneous understanding of that clause is found in the events of the first week of the first session of Congress in 1789. In the very week that Congress approved the Establishment Clause as part of the Bill of Rights for submission to the states, it enacted legislation for paid chaplains and for the House and the Senate. This court says it is clear that the 17 draftsmen of the Constitution who were members of the first Congress nor the Congress of 1789 saw any establishment problem in the employment of congressional chaplains to offer daily prayers in the Congress, a practice that has continued for nearly 2 centuries, and it should be difficult to identify a more striking example of accommodation of religious belief intended by the framers. You see, if our founding fathers wanted to strip Judeo-Christian principles from public life based on what they said in the First Amendment, then a very simple question is to ask this: why did the exact same people that ratified that amendment also put chaplains in the House, in the Senate, in the military, in the very same week that they passed the First Amendment? See, here's the secularist point of view, and this is what needs to be pointed out to our children. The secularist point of view is essentially this: the founding fathers gave us this principle, a strict wall of separation between church and state, and then they ignored the principle they gave us the very same week. And then they ignored the principle that they gave us prior to that time as well. I mean, the whole idea becomes somewhat insane, doesn't it? It becomes ridiculous. And yet this is what needs to be pointed out by the Bible-believing Christian. Let me take you to number 4. Fourth problem with what the court did in 1962 and 1963. Number 4, the court applied the First Amendment to the states despite the fact that the First Amendment is only a limitation on federal power. Now, something that needs to be understood about our system of governance. Our system of governance is this: we in the United States of America don't have one government, we have 2 layers of government. We have government at the national level, and then we have government where? At the state level. Now, why do we have that? And this is what's called federalism. You might recognize the 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states or to the people. Federalist Paper number 45 says this: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Where is the real power supposed to rest according to our Constitution? Not with the national government, but with the state governments. The opposite is true today, isn't it? Today, all the power rests with the national government, and the state governments have less and less power. The federal government has become what I like to call Fedzilla, and the state governments are progressively getting weaker. See, it's the exact opposite of what our founding fathers originally gave us. Now, why did they set it up this way? They set it up this way because they were fearful of man. Because man has what kind of nature? A sin nature. The book of Jeremiah, chapter 17 and verse 9 says, the human heart is deceitfully wicked above all things. Who can understand it? So our founding fathers, fearful of human nature, understood what Lord Acton said: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts what? Absolutely. And that's why they divided power up. First, they divided it up horizontally amongst three branches of government. And secondly, they divided it up vertically between national government and the state governments. And all of this relates to a biblical anthropology or doctrine of man that our founding fathers were steeped in. Had our founding fathers not been steeped in what the Bible says about man, that man is a sinner in need of grace, we would not have the type of government arrangement that we have today. Because the government arrangement that we have today makes zero sense. It's very inefficient unless you understand the corruptibility and the imperfection of human nature. The United States government is based on this idea of a fear of human nature. Here's what the Federalist Papers say, Federalist Paper number 51. Now, if you're under 40, you might not have ever heard of the Federalist Papers. What are the Federalist Papers? The Federalist Papers were written to the New York citizens in the New York newspaper to try to convince them to accept the Constitution. So the Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, are a tremendous source of light as to what our founding fathers were thinking. So they write in Federalist Paper number 51, what is government but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You first must enable it to control the governed, and in the next place you must oblige it to control itself. So our founding fathers said, look, we've got a little problem here called sin. We've got to make the government strong enough to act as a deterrent to the sinful impulses of people that want to commit crimes. But at the same time, those that run the government have an equally tainted sin nature. So their solution to the whole thing was to divide up political power. Now, one of the things that you see about the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Let me read that again. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Was the First Amendment a restraint on state power or national power? National power. But you see, the court, when they took the First Amendment and applied it to what was happening in a public school in an individual state, took the First Amendment and they wrenched it out of context and they made it applicable to the state government. And Barron versus Baltimore, a little excerpt here from Chief Justice John Marshall. John Marshall was our third Chief Justice to the United States Supreme Court. John Marshall says the Constitution was ordained and established by the people of the United States for themselves, for their own government, and not the government of the individual states. Therefore, the Bill of Rights would be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The Bill of Rights contains no expression indicating an intention to apply them to the states. So what in the world happened? How can a court in 1962 and 1963 take an amendment that is applicable only to the national government and apply it down to the states? They used a little trick called the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was passed much later in American history, around 1868. It was basically an amendment designed to protect the rights of recently emancipated slaves. It says over and over again, no state, no state. And so what the Supreme Court said is, what we'll do is we'll make the First Amendment applicable to the states through the 14th Amendment. And by 1947, sweeping language was now on the books in a case called Everson versus Board of Education. And here's what a relevant portion of that case says. It says, in the words of Jefferson, the clause against the establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. The wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve of the slightest breach. Now, in this Everson case, and try to track with me as I'm talking, I know some of this can be hard to follow, but I think if you get some of this history down, it'll be a blessing to you. That particular case dealt with Roman Catholics who wanted to take their kids, bus them out of the public schools and go through some Roman Catholic training at their individual parish and bus them with public school buses back to school for just a couple of hours of the day. The court actually in 1947, in this Everson case that I'm trying to explain, upheld that arrangement. But in the process, they put on the books in a sweeping legal language this concept of separation between church and state. This is the first time a court ever applied separation of church and state to the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, and it's the first time in history the United States Supreme Court ever applied the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, not to the national governments, but to the where? The state governments. So although that arrangement with the Roman Catholic institutions was upheld, this language was floating on the books, awaiting how the Supreme Court would further abuse it a few years later in 1962 and 1963. And let me make you aware of a little piece of history that is very forgotten. The guy that authored that decision in 1947 is a guy named Justice Hugo Black. And what you'll never hear from anyone, but it's true when you look it up, is Hugo Black had in his background membership in the KKK. Ku Klux Klan in his background. Now, if you're a member of the KKK, in essence, you realize that you hate three groups of people, right? You hate, number one, blacks. You hate, number two, Jews. And you hate, number three, Roman Catholics. And that's why Hugo Black, in this case involving Roman Catholics, I believe largely put into the legal system this sweeping language. It was basically bigotry on his part against Roman Catholicism. But the fourth problem is the court applied the First Amendment to the states, despite the fact that the First Amendment is only a limitation on federal power. Let me take you to we're at number 5 here. You still tracking with me? Number 5. The fifth problem with what the court did in 1962 and 1963 is it ignored the original intent of the 14th Amendment. See, not only did they ignore the original intent of the First Amendment, but let me show you really quickly how they ignored the original intent of the 14th Amendment. What does the 14th Amendment have to do with religion? Zero. Nothing. The 14th Amendment exists to give rights to slaves that were emancipated. It has nothing to do with religious practice at all. And so by coupling the First Amendment with the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court in 1962 and 1963 basically trashed two amendments, not one, but two. There is something called the Blaine Amendment. The Blaine Amendment offered by Representative Blaine of Maine 7 years after the 14th Amendment came into existence. And the Blaine Amendment wanted to take the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, make it applicable to the states through the 14th Amendment. And the very legislative body that had debated, that had discussed, that had ratified and adopted the 14th Amendment rejected that. And so when the court came along in 1962 and 1963, and they coupled the two amendments together, in essence what they did is they disrespected the original intent of the 14th Amendment. One Judge Learned Hand, pointed this out years later. He says the 14th Amendment's defeat was a stark contrast to the fact that the adopters of the 14th Amendment never intended to incorporate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment against the states. So number 5, the court ignored the original intent of the 14th Amendment. Number 6, the court in 1962 and 1963 failed to cite a single precedent. Now, what is a precedent? A precedent is what a prior court has done. We have a principle in the law called stare decisis. Stare decisis is a Latin expression. It basically means let precedent stand. And so when you're arguing before a court, because courts are supposed to follow what other courts have done, and if courts just start overturning what other courts have done, it creates instability and chaos in society. What you do when you argue before a court is you try to base your argument on what prior courts have done. And that's basically called precedent. And a good Supreme Court decision will cite multiple precedents. Well, how many precedents did the United States Supreme Court cite in 1962 and 1963 when they pushed prayer and Bible reading out of the schools? They cited no precedents. In fact, in the language of the decision, this is what it says. Finally, in Engel versus Vitale, only last year, these principles, that's their precious doctrine of separation between church and state, these principles were so universally recognized that the court, watch this, without the citation of a single case, affirmed them. So this is sort of the game that's played in legal circles. You get a decision that is against God, and then all the people that have an anti-God agenda, and do you know there's a lot of those people running around, what do they quote? They keep quoting that one decision over and over again, and they keep saying you need to respect settled law, when the fact of the matter is the decision came into existence trashing settled law. See, the Supreme Court in 1962 and 1963 trashed settled law. And now what is the left saying today? We need to respect settled law. It's an exercise in hypocrisy, isn't it? It's completely inconsistent what they're doing. And as you track this through, what you'll discover is all of the subsequent decisions that have come down fail to cite anything prior to 1947. 1947 is the first time, as I mentioned before, that this sweeping language came on the books. For example, in the case called Stone versus Graham, 1980, which says it's unconstitutional to hang the Ten Commandments on the public school wall, they cited 9 precedents after 1947, but 0 precedents before 1947. You know, it's almost like we had the American Revolution, and then we're fast forwarded to 1947, And what about that whole section of American history between the American Revolution and 1947? That's what's missing, see? That's what's missing from Supreme Court opinions. That's what's missing from the thinking of lawyers. That's what's missing from the minds of your children and your grandchildren. And because of our ignorance of that section of history, that's why we are so vulnerable to secularist lies. Satan preys on ignorance. He wants to keep us in the dark. He wants to erase vast parts of our culture from memory because he knows he can manipulate us because we're ignorant of our past. If you learn nothing else from this presentation, just learn this much. The person that controls the interpretation of history controls the future. If we think that our founding fathers gave us a strict wall of separation between church and state, and we believe that, then the game is over. They can purge everything that's Christian out of public life. So the courts failed to cite a single precedent in these cases. This takes us to number 7. Cheer up, it's about to get worse. Number 7, the court erroneously believed in 1962 and 1963 that the Bible causes psychological damage. Now, this is what you call a priori reasoning. A priori reasoning is reasoning ahead of time. In other words, what people do is they come to their conclusion ahead of time, and then they try to make the evidence fit their conclusion, rather than building their conclusion from the evidence, you see. So if you're involved with criminal investigations or police work, you talk to a really good police officer that investigates crimes, what you'll learn is if they're good at their trade, they try not to develop a theory on the case, in other words, who the bad guy is, too quick. Because if you point to this person over here and say, you're the murderer, you're the bad guy, what's the temptation? Try to make the evidence fit the theory, rather than letting the evidence speak for itself. And that's a problem called a priori reasoning. And so the court had already concluded that the Bible causes psychological damage, so they reached back into American history and manipulated it to get the Bible out of the schools. Now, how do I know that they believe the Bible causes psychological damage? Let me read to you a few sentences from the decision. They said, but if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be found, and in his specific experience with children, Dr. Grazel, that's a psychologist, observed, had been psychically harmful to the child and had caused a divisive force within the social media of the school. So they relied on this psychologist who says if you read portions of the New Testament with no commentary, it could psychologically damage the child. They assumed that was true, and then they reached back in American history and they twisted things around to push the Bible out. That's what happened. Now, I can tell you from personal experience that the Bible has done more to heal me psychologically than any other book that's ever been written. You know, you should have seen me before I came to Christ. I was a virtual basket case. I'm still a borderline basket case. My wife's up here. She can give a second witness to that. But you see, the Bible, in such a huge way, has tremendously helped me in the area of bitterness, in the area of anxiety. And why didn't they consider any evidence like that, the Bible being psychologically helpful? They only considered the fact that the Bible is psychologically damaging. This takes us now to number 8, getting close to wrapping up here. Number 8. When the Supreme Court did this in 1962 and 1963, they acted as the Constitution's amender rather than its interpreter. Now, people say this all the time. Well, the Constitution is an old document. We now live, the Constitution was written in the 18th century. We now live in the 21st century. I mean, how can we really be bound by 18th century principles? Have you heard that argument? Well, a couple of answers to that are, number one, the Constitution is always relevant because the Constitution is a restraint on human nature. Does human nature ever change? No, it doesn't. That's why the Constitution is relevant for any generation. And beyond that, if you want to change the Constitution gives you the formula to change it. It's called Article 5, the amendment process. To change the document, to change language of the document, that is a task given to the people's representatives. Now, why is that so significant? Because if I don't like the way they're changing it, I can vote against my representative in the next election cycle. If the Supreme Court changes the document, what recourse do I have? None. Because judges at the federal level are appointed for how long? For life. They don't run for election. So if I don't like the way they're rewriting the Constitution, I have no recourse against them through the ballot box. Do you want to know why Americans are so frustrated this day and age? Because we feel powerless. Why do we feel powerless? We are powerless to a large extent because we've allowed this manipulation of our system to go on and on for so long. One of the things that David Barton points out in his writings is that those judges that ruled in the way that they did all came from backgrounds as legislators or governors. Only one of the 8 that made those decisions in 1962 and 1963 was actually a judge for their career. So David Barton writes this: interestingly, Justice Potter Stewart was the only justice who objected to the removal of prayer on the basis of precedent. He alone acted as judge, and the rest acted as politicians. Taking you back just for a minute to George Washington. George Washington wrote this: if in the opinion of the people the distribution or modification of constitutional powers be at any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment the way the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation. Though they may in one instance be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The Founding Fathers never wanted the Supreme Court to have the power to rewrite the Constitution because, as George Washington said, look, even if they do good with that power in one instance, the tools and the mechanism is in place to do great evil. And I believe great evil was done with these 1962, 1963 decisions that we're looking at. In fact, the Supreme Court has actually said this: with 5 votes, we can do anything. Why 5 votes? Because you only need 5 votes for a majority opinion. And now with the death of Justice Scalia, and with a potential Obama appointee to the Supreme Court, the liberal voting bloc is almost in place. All they have to do is cobble together 5 votes to literally reshuffle our system from top to bottom. Isn't it interesting that all these decisions that have come down recently, with the same-sex marriage decision, the Hobby Lobby decision, these are all narrow 5-4 decisions. It's almost like one side barely wins and the other side barely loses, depending on what mood some justice might be in on that particular day, and that's the situation that we find ourselves in. Number 9. The court applied its new separation of church and state doctrine selectively only to Christianity, and gave other non-Christian religions a virtual free pass. Why is it that separation of church and state is only applied to Christianity? Why is it never applied, for example, to Islam? Here's a newspaper article. In the wake of September 11th, an increasing number of California public schools must attend an intensive 3-week course on Islam. This course mandates that 7th graders learn the tenets of Islam, study the important figures of the faith, wear a robe, adopt a Muslim name, stage their own jihad. Now, how are seventh graders going to stage their own jihad? That would be very interesting to watch. The students must memorize many verses in the Quran and are taught to pray in the name of Allah, in the compassionate, the merciful, and are instructed to chant, "Praise Allah, the Lord of creation." Now, how come separation of church and state doesn't apply there? How come it never applies to New Agers? By the way, New Agers have told us that they are going to use the public schools to indoctrinate the next generation. One New Ager says this: "I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won where? In the public school classroom, by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity that recognizes and respects the spark of divinity that theologians call the spark of divinity within." Listen to this. "These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers." How come when they tell us that they're going to use the public schools to teach the New Age movement, the separation of church and state never comes up in that instance? In fact, humanists have boasted that they will take over the public schools and use them to indoctrinate the next generation. One humanist as early as 1930 said this: "Education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every public school is a school of humanism. What can the theistic Sunday schools meeting for 1 hour a week, teaching only a fraction of the children, do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching?" And we wonder why we're losing the next generation. See, the enemy has been strategically at work. And yet separation of church and state never applies to humanism, never applies to Islam, never applies to the New Age movement. It's always selectively applied to the Bible-believing Christian prayers, Christian scripture, and so forth. So, you kind of look through this list and it seems somewhat depressing, doesn't it? What did the Supreme Court do in 1962 and 1963? Number one, they read words into the First Amendment that simply aren't there. Number two, they relied upon and took out of context a letter written by Thomas Jefferson more than a decade after the Constitution was created. Number three, they ignored the legislative activities of those who authored the First Amendment. Number four, they applied the First Amendment to the states in spite of the fact that the First Amendment describes itself only as a limitation on federal power. Number five, they ignored the original intent of the 14th Amendment. Number six, they failed to cite a single precedent. Number seven, they erroneously believed that Christianity causes psychological damage. Number eight, they acted as the Constitution's amender rather than its interpreter. And then number nine, they selectively applied their new doctrine only to Christianity, not to non-Christian religions. You say, wow, Andy, harsh critique. But it's not mine only. Listen to the words of William Rehnquist, the former Chief Justice to the United States Supreme Court, as he was talking about separation of church and state in an opinion. He calls this idea not wholly accurate, can only be dimly perceived. Its lack of historical support, the mischievous diversion of judges from the actual intentions of the drafters of the Bill of Rights, a metaphor based on bad history. Then he says it should frankly and explicitly be abandoned. Is it not interesting that the very voices that call for a purging of Christianity from public life also want the government to grow bigger and bigger and bigger? As the government puts its fingers into every area of our lives, the very people that call for that want Christianity purged from the government. What are they designing? They're designing a country without God, is what they're designing. As the government grows, Christianity shrinks. Christianity's influence shrinks as this separation doctrine goes unchallenged. One political commentator put it this way: first they claim that there is no place for religion in the public square, and then they expand the public square to include everything. Well, so what? Great information. What do you want us to do with it? That's why I had you open up to Hebrews 4, verse 6. See, that was my introduction. Now we're getting to the passage. No, just kidding. We're going to do this fast. 4 things I want you to take away from this talk. Number 1, gain knowledge. Knowledge is what? Power. Hosea 4 and verse 6 says, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. It's interesting, he doesn't say my people are destroyed for a lack of enthusiasm. He doesn't say my people are destroyed for a lack of zeal. He specifically says my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because we have a basic lack of understanding of these things, we are susceptible and vulnerable to deception and propaganda. Number 2, give yourself to prayer for those in government. There's a reason why Paul writes in 1 Timothy 4, 1 through 4, first of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers and petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men. For who? Kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. You know who was running the show when Paul wrote that? A guy that was a lot worse than our Supreme Court, a guy named Nero, who was taking Christians and lighting them on fire to illumine his garden parties. A man who burned Rome to the ground and blamed it on the Christians. And in that darkness, Paul says, I want you to intercede for him. And I've described a lot of darkness here, but that's no excuse for us as God's people not to be interceding for those that rule over us. Let me ask you a question. Do you know the names of the people on the Supreme Court? Do you know the names of your city council members? Do you know the names of your senators, your representatives? I would simply ask this: how can we intelligently be praying for people when we don't even know who they are? See, we need to study and become aware and become the intercessors in these last days that God has called us to become. Number 3, be a good steward over your blessings. Do you know you're blessed radically by God? 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 2 says this, in the case, moreover, it is required of stewards that one be found what? Faithful or trustworthy. A steward is not an owner, but a what? A manager. We are given things by God to manage on his behalf. And one of these days, he's going to call us into an account and asked us how we manage those things. You automatically have 3: time, talent, and treasure. The 3 T's. Can I add something else to your list? Your own government. We live in a country where we have freedoms through the ability to participate in government, through voting, through running for office ourselves, through speaking out. We have rights that people around the world could never even dream of having. And may I just say to you, with this privilege comes responsibility. And God is going to ask us one day how we were good stewards over this great blessing that we have been given, this great self-experiment in liberty called the United States of America. Can I give you a very sad statistic? Half of Christians are even registered to vote. Of those that actually show up and vote that are registered Christians, half of them show up. And then the ones that actually show up and vote, a lot of times they're not even thinking about God. They're thinking about, am I going to lose some kind of contract? How did my parents vote? Could you imagine how different this country would be if every single born-again Christian went into the voting booth, all of us were registered, and we didn't vote based on loyalty to a particular party. We voted Bible top to bottom. mean, could you imagine the shock waves we would send through Satan's system just by being basic stewards? And then finally, and with this I'm finished, we need to reclaim and teach American history. And that's sort of what I've given you in a snapshot here. I've given you an American history lesson. Judges 2 and verse 10 says this: "There arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel." There arose a generation that knew nothing about the Exodus. There arose a generation that knew nothing about the captivity. There arose a generation that knew nothing about the patriarch Abraham. There arose a generation that knew nothing about Jericho and the river that they passed through, and on, all of the miracles God had done. What happened? Parents and grandparents stopped communicating truth to their children. And there arose a whole generation of children that knew nothing of what God had done. May I just say to you that it is exactly where we are today in the United States of America. Your children and your grandchildren know almost nothing based on some of the information that I've provided today. And you know, I'll tell you one thing, they're not going to get it from the news. They're not going to get it through academia. They're not going to get it through the public school system. Sad to say, they're not even going to get it through most churches. They'll get it through a good church like this one, but most churches wouldn't touch a topic like this with a 10-foot pole. That's why I'm so grateful for a pastor like Paul Van Oy that would invite a guy like me into his pulpit. This guy's taking a risk. So where are they going to learn this information? They've got to learn it from their parents and their grandparents, and we have to reclaim American history that has been distorted and warped and lost, and we've got to reach that next generation. And I think the world will be a better place if we did that. Pretty strong message today. I appreciate your patience. Went just a tad long. But just a word of warning in these last days, a time of equipping and a challenge related to what we shall do. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we are grateful for your church and this country. I ask us, Father, that you'd make us faithful stewards of what you've given us and help us to stand out like lights in the midst of darkness, in the midst of these last days. We'll be careful to give you all the praise and the glory. We ask these things in Jesus' name, and God's people said, amen.
If you are blessed by this teaching ministry, please consider partnering with us. We trust the resources here will also be a blessing to others around the world. Send a gift of any size to Candlelight Christian Fellowship, P.O. Box 2555, Hayden, Idaho, 83835. We warmly welcome you to join us each Sunday and Wednesday online or in person at Candlelight Christian Fellowship, located in beautiful Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, 5725 North Pioneer Drive. Our service times are at 9 and 10:45 every Sunday morning and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Join Pastor Paul Van Oy as he continues teaching us God's Word, verse by verse. For recorded video and audio archives, visit our website, candlelightfellowship.org.